10. Ryan Kennedy and Jesse Jones. In a botched robbery attempt that was partially captured on video in early 2022, a Florida man and his sister-in-law fought off a couple who allegedly attacked them in Miami Beach. According to police, it all started when the suspects approached and assaulted the 18-year-old male victim, whose sister-in-law came to his defense. Meanwhile, a bystander pulled out their phone and hit the record button. Ryan Kennedy and Jesse Jones were accused of snatching the young man's iPhone out of his pocket. An all-out brawl ensued between the two parties, during which one of the suspects hurled racist statements at the victim, saying things like, "You don't belong here," and "Go back to Puerto Rico." The suspects may have been unaware that Puerto Rico is actually part of the United States, something Americans should know, but the comments were incredibly ignorant either way. During the fight, one of the victims could be heard saying, "We're Americans," while one of the suspects responded by saying, "No, you're not." Police arrested Kennedy and Jones in front of their home, where the fight occurred, on suspicion of strong-arm robbery and aggravated battery. The charges also came with hate crime enhancements due to the things that were said during the altercation. Several months after the incident, they came forward and claimed that the viral video of the incident didn't capture everything. The pair accused the victims of following them home and attacking them. They denied stealing from the victim and said that the footage takes the situation out of context. Their attorney, Michael Greco, told 7 Miami News that his clients regretted the nature of their statements during the fight, but he argued that Jones and Kennedy didn't commit a crime and that they acted in self-defense. There have been no updates on the case since late 2022, when the prosecution asked the judge for a continuance so they'd have time to reanalyze the case. 9. Tamara Hernandez. If you behave unacceptably in public these days, you can count on a bystander pulling out their phone and hitting the record button. It's precisely what a man named Greg Conn did at a gas station in Phoenix, Arizona, when a woman who was later identified as Tamara Hernandez lashed out in a racist diatribe. According to Conn, the ordeal began when Hernandez entered the store to complain about her gas pump not working. She then began arguing with another woman and told her to go back to Mexico. Hernandez also claimed to be the gas station's manager and instructed the woman to leave. Except she wasn't really the manager, and as the woman walked away, Hernandez grabbed her. The woman, who was actually Native American and not Mexican, responded by slapping Hernandez in the face. Hernandez's husband, Bob, went on the news and tearfully apologized on behalf of his wife, who he said suffers from mental illness. He described Hernandez's behavior as indefensible, but also went on to say that his wife never would have acted like that even a year ago. Bob further explained that Hernandez's behavior became increasingly paranoid about a year earlier after they were targeted in a home break-in. And afterward, Hernandez reportedly began making up wild stories, and her mental state deteriorated from there. Following the viral gas station incident, Bob called a crisis intervention team to hopefully help to get to the bottom of his wife's issues. 8. Thomas Newcombe, David Moran, and Thomas Driver. During a Ku Klux Klan meeting in northeastern Florida in 2014, a confidential FBI informant learned of a plot between 2 prison guards and a former co-worker to kill a black former inmate who had been released from a prison in the area. According to an affidavit, the planned hit was in retaliation for a fight between the prisoner and 25-year-old Thomas Jordan Driver, a corrections employee who claimed that the inmate bit him in an alleged attempt to give him AIDS and hepatitis. 47-year-old corrections officer David Elliott Moran and his former co-worker, 42-year-old Charles Thomas Newcombe, were also involved in the plot. The suspects had a few different plans in mind. One was to kidnap the victim from his home in Palatka and overdose him with insulin, while the other involved fatally gunning the man with a 9mm handgun. Thankfully, the informant tipped off the FBI and the victim was never harmed. The informant helped the feds build a case against the scheming trio by volunteering to be the hitmen and conducting surveillance on the victim with the suspects while wearing a wire. And when the suspects were shown a picture of the victim that the FBI staged to look like he had been shot, they expressed their happiness, unaware that the conversation was being recorded. In April 2015, the feds arrested Driver, Newcombe, and Moran with conspiracy to commit murder. Driver pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Newcombe and Moran, however, were convicted by a jury and each received a 12-year prison sentence. 7. Janelle Ambrosia. Before the modern-day Karen stereotype came into existence, there was Janelle Ambrosia, a Western New Yorker and Karen times 10, who made national headlines for throwing an explosive racist tirade on camera in 2014. The target of the rage was a 36-year-old Buffalo man named Narvel Benning, who said that the ordeal began during a quick stop at a dollar store on his way to work. Benning later told News One that when he left the store and started his truck, the sound of the ignition turning over startled some children who were standing nearby with their mother. The woman, later identified as Janelle Ambrosia, allegedly flew into a rage at Benning and began throwing racial slurs at him. But rather than arguing back, he pulled out his phone and began recording. The father of 4 stayed remarkably calm as he documented the disturbing diatribe, which included the repeated use of a certain hateful word as Ambrosia continued to raise her voice and got closer to the vehicle. When the prospect of calling the police came up, Ambrosia bragged that she slept with law enforcement during her time working as a stripper. She also made a phone call to someone who she claimed was her boyfriend, blaming Benning for the interaction. During a subsequent interview with local radio station WBLK, Ambrosia blamed Benning for the incident, claiming that he called her a crack-headed cracker before he began filming their conversation. She'd later take that claim back though, in an apology that seemed half-hearted at best, and blamed her mental instability for her behavior. Speaking with News One, Benning mentioned how a lot of racism in Western New York tends to get swept under the rug. In other words, it happens in a more covert fashion than he experienced during his run-in with Ambrosia. But he said that the incident should serve as a reminder that racism is very much alive and well in the region. He expressed sadness for Ambrosia's children and the types of beliefs he imagined they were being raised with, and called for a more proactive and honest dialogue about racism in the Great Buffalo area. No charges were ever filed against Ambrosia, which was understandably disappointing to many. But in a region where world travels like wildfire and gossip is a top-ranked pastime, it wasn't something people were going to forget anytime soon. And it's probably safe to assume that it took a very long time for her to live down her behavior. Benning and his family have since relocated to another state and are thriving. 6. Harry Johannes Nosen. We tend to think of pastors as peaceful people, but not all of them are, and some even use religion to justify their hateful views and actions. Case in point, 61-year-old Harry Johannes Nosen, a white South African preacher who plotted to overthrow the country's government and kill thousands of black people. Nosen led the National Christian Resistance Movement, NCRM, which is also known as the Crusaders. It's a right-wing group that uses religion to rationalize its racist and other prejudiced views. And in keeping with this strategy, Nosen claimed he was ordained to reclaim South Africa for white people. He planned to accomplish this goal through a series of attacks on police and military institutions, but primarily black communities. The crazed white supremacist recruited members mainly via social media, where he specifically sought out military veterans and encouraged people to commit violence against black victims. Nosen also shared recipes for making homemade explosives. In addition, the group discussed various potential ways of quickly killing large numbers of victims, including through the use of biological weapons and poisoning water sources. Thankfully, the NCRM was easy enough for investigators to track, owing to its widespread online presence. And Nosen was arrested in 2019. During a search of his property in the small town of Middelburg, law enforcement found guns and ammunition. In addition to weapons and social media evidence, prosecutors relied on previously convicted witnesses to secure a conviction against the disgraced pastor. Nosen was found guilty of high treason, incitement to carry out violent attacks, and recruiting people to commit attacks. As a result, he received a double life sentence, which means he'll never see freedom again. Since Noson's arrest, South African police and intelligence services have foiled multiple NCRM schemes and arrested several of its leaders throughout the country. 5. Patrick Stein, Curtis Allen, and Gavin Wright. Between 2015 and 2018, 250 Muslim refugees from Somalia and other countries settled in Garden City, Kansas. Eager to pursue a better future for themselves and their families, many of these new residents took jobs at a local Tyson meatpacking plant. And like most asylum seekers, they work hard, live respectably, and embrace their new country. Unfortunately though, not all Americans are welcoming toward refugees. 3 men named Patrick Eugene Stein, Curtis Wayne Allen, and Gavin Wayne Wright were especially hateful toward the newcomers. In 2016, the trio conspired to blow up a housing complex and mosque in Garden City that houses a large number of Somali residents. Calling themselves the Crusaders, the group plotted the attack for the day after the presidential election in November. According to prosecutors, the suspects were members of the so-called 3% movement, an anti-government subculture that promotes a readiness to take armed action against any perceived threat to Americans' constitutional rights. Based largely on conspiracy theories, paranoia, and far-right ideology, it's considered an extremist movement, and its so-called values fall in line with the beliefs that the trio embraced. Stein, Allen, and Wright thought of Garden City's recently arrived immigrants as cockroaches, despite their apparent lack of contact with the refugee community that they hated so much. The group was also anti-Muslim. According to the FBI, Stein had a habit of riding around the streets with guns and targeting random civilians with racial insults, including women. Inspired by the actions of Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh, the Crusaders hoped their violent act would wake people up and inspire others to commit terroristic acts against people who they felt were a threat to their version of the American lifestyle and culture. They made organized plans and wrote a manifesto calling on others to follow in their footsteps. And above all, they were intent on acquiring explosives strong enough to level the housing complex and kill its occupants. Luckily though, the FBI was listening in, and they managed to foil the plot before the group could put it into action. Stein, Allen, and Wright were arrested for their alleged roles in the planned bombing. A jury convicted all 3 defendants on 1 count each of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and conspiracy to violate the housing rights of their intended victims. And, as a consequence, they all received prison sentences ranging between 25 and 30 years. 4. Suzanne Kraft. An interracial family living in Louisville, Kentucky's Lake Forest neighborhood must have been terrified when they began receiving threatening racist letters in the mail in 2020. The letters reportedly contained death threats, and there were even bullets in some of the parcels. And that same year, 2 homes in the same community were vandalized with racist graffiti. According to Wave 3, Michael and Connie Pineda reported finding swastikas and racial slurs spray-painted on their driveway. And on other occasions, they arrived home to find their grass burned and their driveway egged. Michaela told Wave 3 that she was surprised by the hate-filled vandalism, which began several months after her family moved into the neighborhood. Until then, her interactions with neighbors had been pleasant, and Lake Forest felt safe. Thankfully, residents and local officials alike condemned the hate crimes and displayed overwhelming support for the Pineda family. But the couple's teenage children were understandably left traumatized and scared by the experience, which they should have never had to go through in the first place. Federal investigators traced the racist letters to 55-year-old Suzanne Kraft, who was charged with 5 counts of mailing threatening communications with racial intent. She was convicted on all counts and was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Kraft was also hit with state-level charges of criminal mischief and harassment, and the case appears to be ongoing. Unfortunately though, Kentucky doesn't have a hate crime law. But the disturbing crimes against the Pinedas served as a reminder of why it's a good idea to lobby for one. 3. Howard Murphy. Some racists seem to enjoy piggybacking off the notoriety of other prejudiced individuals by making their move in the wake of a major hate crime. That appeared to be the case for 60-year-old Howard Murphy, who defaced his neighbor's fence in the town of Niagara, New York with racist graffiti. And to make matters even worse, Murphy did this just 2 days after a deranged gunman committed a mass shooting at a top supermarket in nearby Buffalo. Murphy's neighbor, Johnny Parks, discovered the graffiti on his way to work after grabbing his morning coffee. Upon taking a closer look, he noticed that it said the word "kill" along with a racial slur. Parks told the Lockport Union Sun and Journal that he was shocked by the incident. In his many years living in the neighborhood, he only recalled speaking to Murphy on one occasion about a decade earlier, when Murphy's dog pooped in his yard. He asked Murphy to clean it up, but he didn't do it, so Parks put up a "no poop zone" sign in his yard, and Murphy began walking his dog across the street. While their interaction wasn't exactly friendly, Parks had a hard time thinking that perhaps he was targeted as the result of a long-standing grudge that Murphy had never addressed with him directly. But in the absence of any other rational explanation, it was the most logical motive that he could think of for the unprovoked hate crime. Whatever the problem was, Parks also said that he wished Murphy had come to him directly, because he wouldn't have wanted his neighbor's anger to fester. Vandalism is a somewhat minor charge, but considering the nature of the graffiti, prosecutors imposed the highest possible charge allowable: 1 count of second-degree criminal mischief hate crime. The charge can carry a sentence of up to 15 years. Whether or not Murphy's timing on the heels of a mass shooting motivated by racism was deliberate, his actions were especially traumatizing for both the victims and the community as a whole. Once Murphy was arrested, Parks said he wanted to let the courts deal with it and move forward from what happened. He also said that he was considering using an outpouring of donations he received to buy doorbell cameras for the houses along his street, since a lack of surveillance footage had proven to be a hurdle to the investigation. With the presence of more cameras, it would help to ensure documentation if a similar crime ever happened in the future. Howard Murphy pleaded guilty as charged and was sentenced to 2 1/3 years to 7 years in state prison. And, according to records, he'll become eligible for parole in August 2025, but his latest possible release date is in 2030. 2. Patrick Cruzius. On the morning of August 3, 2019, a young man arrived at a Walmart store near the US-Mexico border in El Paso, Texas. He'd driven 700 miles overnight from his home in suburban Dallas with a very specific goal in mind. Armed with an assault rifle, 21-year-old Patrick Cruzius exited his vehicle and began shooting at customers in the parking lot. The barrage of bullets continued as he proceeded into the store, where panicked employees and customers were attempting to flee for their lives. By the time he left the store and surrendered at a nearby intersection, Cruzius had killed 23 people, including 13 Americans, 8 Mexican citizens, and 1 German. He'd also injured 22 others. It was soon discovered that the mass shooter had posted a manifesto online expressing his desire to eliminate Hispanic people from Texas. But more specifically, he wanted to kill Mexicans. In the disturbing document, Cruzius expressed an array of hateful white supremacist and anti-immigrant beliefs. He spoke of a Hispanic invasion of Texas and claimed that he was trying to defend America from what he described as a cultural and ethnic replacement. The shooter went on to say that neither then-President Donald Trump nor the Republican Party influenced his views. In other words, he was hateful all on his own. Cruzius was hit with 90 federal charges, including 22 counts of committing a hate crime resulting in death, 22 counts of use of a firearm to commit murder, 23 counts of a hate crime involving an attempt to kill, and 23 counts of use of a firearm during a crime. He ultimately pleaded guilty to all counts in order to avoid the death penalty and received 90 life sentences as a result. To some, a lifetime in prison doesn't amount to justice for someone who committed such a horrific massacre. Many believe Cruzius should have gotten the death penalty, and it's understandable considering the gravity of his actions. But maximum security federal prisons are generally not enjoyable places, and considering his age, he's likely going to be there for a long time before he passes away. At the very least, it's comforting to know that he'll languish for decades without the freedoms and comforts that are afforded to law-abiding civilians on the outside. Cruzius is also facing state-level charges, and the district attorney has expressed his plans to pursue the death penalty. The case is expected to go to trial in the year 2024 or 2025, but it's unclear whether the mass killer's state or federal sentence will take precedence over the other. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear even more stories, stay tuned for some extra content that you might have missed. 1. Judy Klein. For more than a year, starting in early 2022, Fatima Suarez and her family were terrorized by their racist neighbor in South St. Louis, Missouri. The campaign of hate crimes included multiple visits to the Suarez family's home, where a woman later identified as 54-year-old Judy Klein was seen on Ring doorbell footage, spewing anti-Hispanic insults and going through the household's mail. In the video, she could be heard saying, "You're a bunch of illegals that don't belong on American property, get out." She also threatened the Suarez family with a hammer and yelled other nonsensical statements including "Get off my property" and "Did you have something to do with 9/11?" Fed up with the woman's behavior, Fatima posted the footage on TikTok, leading to Klein's arrest after the clip went viral in early 2023. According to charging documents, the suspect smashed her way into the victim's home by using a hammer to break a basement window. She then allegedly beat the Suarez family's dryer with the hammer before heading upstairs and trying to enter their living area. The documents also accuse Klein of striking the outside of the home with a hammer after leaving through the front door. Fatima told ABC News that she felt scared, had a hard time sleeping, and cried a lot over the torment her family endured. And her stress only increased as the perpetrator kept returning to the home. A relative of Klein told local station KMOV that the suspect used to live in the house, and property records showed that someone by the same name last owned it during the 1980s. Other court documents revealed that Klein was placed under the care of a court-appointed guardian for 11 years due to her mental health. She was declared fully restored to competency in 2017 and regained full control over her money and personal affairs. But all things considered, it's fair to wonder if she's still struggling from mental health issues. Either way, her behavior is unacceptable, and she's finally being held accountable for it. Klein now faces charges of burglary, property damage, unlawful use of a weapon, and interference with housing rights. In a lot of cases, people with different beliefs are perfectly capable of carrying on a friendship, but everyone has a limit and many draw the line at prejudice and racism.
Number 20. Mihailo Mirageenko. During a visit to Neptune Beach, Florida one evening in June 2023, 20-year-old Mihailo Mirageenko noticed a man and 2 children struggling in the water. They were caught in a rip current and being dragged further out to sea, and there were no lifeguards on duty at the time, so Mihailo rushed into the water to try saving them. According to a police report, he made it out to the family and pushed one of the kids toward their dad. The 3 swimmers eventually made their way to safety, but Mihailo got caught in the riptide. After seeing the young man lying on his back in the water and then vanishing from sight, the father, who just narrowly avoided drowning himself, dialed 911. Crews searched all night for Mihailo, and they found his body at 2:30 a.m., 6 hours after he disappeared. Mihailo, who went by Misha to his loved ones, had recently moved to Jacksonville with his 2 brothers after fleeing war-torn Ukraine and staying at a refugee camp in Norway. He was deeply devoted to his Christian faith and had a reputation for being kind and sympathetic among those who knew him. His parents and several younger siblings were still in Norway when he drowned, leaving his brothers with the grim task of telling them that he'd passed away. Eric Polite, the father who was saved from the water with his 2 kids, gave a touching eulogy at the young man's funeral. He said, "My kids call him a hero, but I believe that they're using the wrong word. My mother told me that angels walk among us. Thank you for saving my kids. I'm forever grateful." Mihailo's 2 brothers told police that he wasn't a strong swimmer, even though he fearlessly entered dangerous waters without a second thought. They said they didn't see him go under the water and that they checked their vehicle to see if he was in it when they couldn't find him. In a statement, police cited the tragedy as a reminder to the public to follow common sense safety rules when it comes to swimming in the Atlantic, like never swimming alone and always staying near a lifeguard. Authorities also urged swimmers to remember that ocean conditions can change rapidly at any time and without warning. A lot of people react on impulse when they see someone in danger, especially when it comes to drowning. But experts warn strongly against jumping into the water without thinking about other possible ways to help someone in distress, especially if you're not a great swimmer. In fact, studies have shown that more people often die trying to rescue victims than they do from the original disaster or emergency. This could easily be explained away by the fact that there are often more rescuers than there are victims. But a closer look at many cases may also show that people often use poor judgment when it comes to deciding if, when, and how to help someone in a dangerous situation. Number 19. Adam Theo. While walking along a busy road in Arlington, Texas one evening in late May 2023, United States Air Force veteran Adam Theo noticed that an argument between a young couple was starting to get out of hand, and as he got closer to the pair, the fight continued to escalate. Theo later told NBC News that a young woman was trying to pull away from a man who was grabbing her shoulders and being slightly aggressive. So he instinctively tried to grab the man's shoulder and pull him away from the woman. The Good Samaritan's decision to intervene was effective in getting the man to take his hands off the female victim, but only because he turned his anger toward Theo and began beating him mercilessly. A bystander named Joseph Scott rushed over to stop the attack while other witnesses dialed 911. Speaking with NBC, Scott said he was super worried about Theo, who was bleeding profusely. The attacker fled the scene as bystanders chased after him, dragging the woman behind him as he ran away. Theo was taken to a local hospital where he received treatment for serious but non-life-threatening injuries. And in a Twitter thread describing the attack in detail, he said he lost count of how many times he'd been hit after 6 punches. Most people would want the suspect to be arrested and punished for the disturbing act of violence. But as a devoted criminal justice reform advocate, Theo didn't think jail was the answer. He told NBC that he'd rather see his attacker get whatever help he needed for his apparent anger problems, and that he thought probation was more appropriate than throwing him behind bars. Police encouraged the public to come forward with information about the suspect and the woman he was with, who still have not been identified. And while Theo's attacker didn't appreciate his attempt to intervene, many others showed their support by donating to a crowdfunding campaign to help him cover expenses during his recovery, which raised over $12,000. Number 18. Tony Steele. Donald Price was out and about in Ossett, England one evening in September 2022 with his friend Tony Steele when he got into an argument with a woman who tried to sell him some salmon he didn't want. The woman, later identified as 52-year-old Lorraine Hargreaves, left the caravan park where she was selling the meat and returned 10 minutes later with 45-year-old Christopher Donaldson and 39-year-old Anthony Sladek. The trio then assaulted Price, punching him repeatedly in the face, and stole his bank card during the altercation. When Price noticed that his bank card was missing several hours later, Steele and another friend offered to accompany him to Hargreaves' house to try getting it back. Another altercation broke out on the home's doorstep between the three men and their three adversaries from earlier that day, and someone stabbed Steele during the confrontation. Price and his friends fled the scene, and Sladek and Donaldson briefly chased after them before Donaldson was seen dropping the knife onto the grass. And as a result, Steele suffered fatal stab wounds to the neck, chest, and upper back. Authorities arrested Sladek, Donaldson, and Hargreaves in connection with his death. Donaldson was found guilty of murder, assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and causing grievous bodily harm with intent. And for his crimes, he was sentenced to 24 years in prison. Sladek was convicted of manslaughter, along with the same assault and bodily harm charges that Donaldson was found guilty of. He received a prison sentence of 11.5 years, while Hargreaves was sentenced to 3 years behind bars for common assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and theft. Number 17. Thierry Bastian. While shopping at a Walmart store in Lauderdale Lakes, Florida with his girlfriend and kids one afternoon in 2023, 41-year-old Thierry Bastian saw a fight break out between a female employee and a young man. It started with an argument in the store's frozen food section and quickly escalated into a physical altercation. The young man, later identified as an off-duty employee named Tyrone Shavar Sterling, dropped a 9mm handgun on the floor as he tried to grab the woman's phone out of her hand. He was demanding to see her text messages, but she refused to hand over the phone. At that point, push literally came to shove, as Sterling allegedly slammed the woman into some shelves. She yelled out for help, but none of her co-workers were coming to her aid, so Bastian attempted to intervene. Instead of diffusing the situation, however, his involvement quickly turned him into Sterling's new target. In a completely unwarranted overreaction to Bastian's attempt to split up the fight, Sterling allegedly picked his handgun up off the floor and fired 10 rounds at him, striking him 6 times in the chest, back, and lower body. Bastian's girlfriend, Makia Ford, told the local 10 News station that she pleaded with Sterling to let her boyfriend live after he fired the first shot. But she said that he continued to mercilessly pull the trigger as he stood over Bastian. Ford described her boyfriend as a hero with a big heart. He didn't deserve what happened to him, and as Ford put it, it's unfair to her or the couple's kids, who now have to carry on without him. Sterling fled the scene, but was apprehended later that day at a nearby apartment complex. He faces 1 count each of first-degree murder and armed robbery by sudden snatching, and is being held without bail at the Broward County Jail. At just 22 years old, he could very well be looking at spending the rest of his days behind bars, if convicted of the charges. Number 16. Anthony Watts. When Pastor Anthony Watts noticed a wrecked motorcycle along a highway in Jackson, Mississippi one evening in April 2023, he stopped to assist the stranded rider. But the biker didn't want the 61-year-old's help. He wanted Anthony's pickup truck. So he shot Watts repeatedly and left him to die along the roadside while he sped off in the Good Samaritan's vehicle. By the time officers responded to the scene, Watts had succumbed to his injuries. Just 2 nights earlier, 4 detainees had escaped from the Raymond Detention Center near Jackson by breaching a cell in the facility's roof. Authorities believe that Casey Grayson, Corey Harrison, Jerry Rains, and Dylan Arrington may have camped out on top of the building before splitting up and going their separate ways. At the time, the men were being held on various felony charges, mostly revolving around theft, but they hadn't been convicted of the allegations. Investigators from the Hinds County Sheriff's Office suspected that the man who killed Watt may have been one of the escaped inmates. He reportedly matched the description of 22-year-old Dylan Arrington, who'd been locked up on charges of auto theft and gun possession. It wasn't Arrington's first rodeo with the law. He'd previously been convicted of auto theft in 2020 and was sentenced to serve 2 years behind bars. But while out on parole a year later, he allegedly stole another car. Arrington posted a $10,000 bond and was freed in early 2022, only to be accused of stealing yet another vehicle just 3 months later. A few weeks after that, investigators found 3 guns in his house and hauled him back to jail, where he remained until his escape in 2023. 2 days after Watt's murder, authorities tracked Arrington down at a home south of Jackson in Leake County. The homeowner had seen him lurking around near the house. And after recognizing Arrington as one of the fugitives, he packed up his family and left. The next morning, the homeowner returned to the property and discovered Arrington inside. Luckily, though, deputies were already in the driveway. Arrington, refusing to face the music, barricaded himself inside the residence. A standoff ensued, and the escaped prisoner set the house on fire after exchanging gunfire with deputies and shooting one of them in the leg. Thankfully, the deputy survived and was transported to the hospital in a stable condition. Authorities waited for the fire to burn out before entering the destroyed home and finding Arrington's charred remains. Although his death meant that he'd never face justice in the court of law for his actions, law enforcement officials seemed glad that Arrington would never shoot another cop, kill another innocent civilian, or terrorize an entire community ever again. The remaining 3 escaped victims were all recaptured within a week of Arrington's death and were sent right back to jail. Number 15. An unappreciated helping hand. While walking along a street in Knoxville, Tennessee one afternoon in August 2022, Thomas Martin was approached by a homeless man who asked for money to buy food. Martin offered to buy a meal for the man, who was later identified as John Bass, and the two proceeded toward a nearby McDonald's restaurant. As they were walking, Bass allegedly struck Miller across the face with a pipe and stole $35 from him. He ran off, and responding officers arrived to find Miller suffering from several severe cuts on his face. They tracked Bass down at a nearby KFC restaurant, where they noticed blood on his hands, and they arrested him on suspicion of aggravated robbery. Just weeks later, a university student's attempt to buy food for a homeless person in the neighboring state of Georgia went wrong in a much different way. Jo Ortega was picking up a DoorDash order at a Popeyes restaurant in Atlanta when she noticed a hungry-looking man outside. She offered to buy him food, but when she tried to purchase some chicken for him at the drive-thru, an employee refused to take the order. Ortega took her phone out and began recording the conversation as she asked the worker why she wasn't allowed to purchase food for the man. An employee who noticed they were being recorded made a remark about how they didn't care that they were being filmed and shut the drive-thru window as Ortega asked for their name. The kind young woman was in utter disbelief over the situation, but she was even more blown away when the police showed up. In a series of TikTok videos about the incident, Ortega said that she was scared she was going to be arrested. Atlanta police confirmed to Fox 5 Atlanta that they responded to a call about a woman who allegedly refused to leave the Popeyes drive-thru. But Ortega didn't break any laws, so no arrests were made. In fact, Ortega claimed that a responding officer pulled her aside and commended her for her generosity. She said the cop thanked her for buying food for someone in need. The homeless man, whose name is Jazz, could be seen holding a Popeyes cup in a follow-up video, so thankfully it appears as though he got something to eat after all. But Ortega's kindness didn't stop there. She started an online fundraiser to help Jazz replace his broken tent, and if possible, to perhaps get him into a more permanent housing arrangement. On the page, she described the incident outside Popeyes, writing, "Oftentimes homeless people are treated like stray animals. If you feed them, they're going to keep coming back." But Ortega said, "I believe that people deserve to be treated like people." The campaign has raised over $4,000 so far, which undoubtedly has gone a long way to improving Jazz's situation, but donations are still being collected for the cause. Number 14. Kenneth Vineyard. 48-year-old single father Kenneth Vineyard and his fiancée Marcy Beatty were at a Walmart store in Monica, Pennsylvania in November 2022 when they witnessed a shooting in the parking lot. Vineyard rushed over to the victim and rendered aid until paramedics arrived. Off-duty Center Township police officer John Hawk approached Vineyard and allegedly ordered him to step away from the victim. But when Vineyard tried to explain that he was just trying to help and that he was trying to get back over to Beatty, who was nearby, Hawk once again ordered him to step away from the victim. He then allegedly shoved the Good Samaritan to the ground. Vineyard hit his head on the pavement, had a seizure, and fell unconscious. After detecting no pulse, Beatty attempted CPR, but failed to revive Vineyard. And unfortunately, he died from his injuries at a nearby hospital, leaving behind a young son. From the get-go, Vineyard's loved ones were convinced that Hawk had murdered him and that the off-duty officer deserved to be criminally charged. Footage of the disturbing incident appeared to show Hawk violently pushing Vineyard and then falling on top of him. The family demanded justice, but encountered one roadblock after another in their attempts to convince authorities to charge Hawk with murder. Beaver County District Attorney David Lozier recused himself from the case due to a conflict of interest, and it fell onto the State Attorney General's desk. In the meantime, Vineyard's loved ones filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Center Township and Officer Hawk. The family's attorney, Joel Sanson, said that the lawsuit aimed to prove that Hawk murdered Vineyard and that local officials knew Hawk was a bad cop with a history of violating people's constitutional rights. Sanson accused the town of failing to properly train, supervise, and discipline Hawk, and he even went as far as saying that Vineyard might still be alive if it weren't for these shortcomings. In the end, the case was settled for $950,000, which went into Kenneth Vineyard's estate. His death was ultimately ruled an accident resulting from hypertension and a plaque build-up in his arteries. But the medical examiner concluded that the blunt force trauma Vineyard experienced during his fall and the stress associated with the confrontation contributed to his death. However, authorities declined to press charges against Hawk. The decision to forego a criminal case obviously came as a major blow to Vineyard's family, who continue to stand by their belief that he was murdered. A Change.org petition pushing for charges against Hawk argues that Vineyard was killed while acting under Good Samaritan law, which is meant to protect civilians who step in and help someone they believe is hurt, sick, incapacitated, or otherwise in peril. For now, however, authorities have made their decision, and they have no apparent plans to consider criminal charges. Number 13. Linda Robson. While driving to a Walmart store in Chester County, South Carolina in August 2021, 63-year-old Linda Robinson spotted a couple stranded on a roadside with their broken-down car. So she pulled over and offered a ride to the pair, who were later identified as Amber Nicole Harris and George Linwood Fail. Then later that morning, a body thought to be Robinson's was found dead on the side of a road. After learning that the grandmother was last seen at Walmart, investigators reviewed surveillance footage from inside the store, and based on the video, they confirmed that the recently discovered body belonged to Robinson. The footage revealed that Harris and Fail waited inside the senior citizen's minivan while she went inside the store to fill a prescription. Police found Robinson's minivan abandoned on the side of a road later that evening. According to detectives, Harris and Fail asked Robinson to drive them to a specific road where Fail beat her to death. The couple then allegedly discarded her body like trash and drove off in her minivan. Chester County Sheriff Max Dorsey said that Robinson helped a lot of people before she crossed paths with the wrong two and paid for it with her life. He spoke of the suspects in less favorable terms, describing Fail as a known meth user who'd been in and out of jail at least 6 times. Amber Nicole Harris had an even lengthier rap sheet, which included 36 prison stints. And at the time of Robinson's murder, the pair were both out on bond after being arrested on drug charges just weeks earlier. Sheriff Dorsey said that he believed they were both high on meth when they allegedly killed Robinson. The couple were arrested the day after the homicide, and thankfully, they've been behind bars at the Chester County Jail ever since while awaiting trial. Harris stands accused of murder, carjacking, and probation violation. She requested bond early on in the case but was denied, then requested it again in March 2023. During a hearing on the matter, Robinson's husband of 44 years, Vernon Robinson, and her daughter spoke about why they thought Harris needed to remain behind bars. Prosecutors also argued their case, describing Harris as a flight risk and a danger to the community, and in the end, the judge denied the bond request. Fail faces 1 count each of murder, carjacking, and a 3rd charge for throwing bodily fluids on a cop, prison employee, or visitor. At this point, Linda's loved ones have been waiting for 2 years for the defendants to go to trial, and they're ready to get it over with. As the cases continue to drag their heels through the court system, the family is getting increasingly frustrated. During an interview with local station WSOC-TV, Vernon urged people to keep a protective watch over their family. He'd admittedly just learned the hard way that people often think something as horrific as a murder of a loved one could never happen in their family, when it's entirely possible. Number 12. Alan Geddes. During an evening out in Aberdeen, Scotland in 2019, 56-year-old Alan Geddes met a 33-year-old man named Stuart Quinn, who'd just been released from prison that day and had nowhere to stay. Geddes offered to pay for a hotel room for Quinn, but the hotel was fully booked, so he invited Quinn to spend the night at his home. Early the next morning, Geddes was discovered dead at the bottom of his staircase with more than 40 stab wounds to his body. Quinn was found at the scene with the knife in his hand and admitted to being the killer. He was charged and ultimately convicted of Geddes' murder and was sentenced to a minimum of 18 years in prison. After investigating the disturbing case, Scotland's Mental Welfare Commission released a damning report revealing multiple systemic shortcomings that contributed to Geddes' death. According to the findings, Quinn had a troubling psychiatric history, which included 4 hospitalizations throughout 2018. And during that time, he was diagnosed with drug-induced psychosis. He also apparently suffered from paranoid delusions. On one occasion, Quinn was involuntarily detained under the country's Mental Health Act after entering his neighbor's flat with a screwdriver in his hand. Even his family members expressed concerns about his behavior, but psychiatrists concluded that he didn't have a mental illness and released him. Quinn spent most of 2019 in jail. He was released in September after spending more than 4 months behind bars, with a comprehensive support plan in place to hopefully prevent him from any more run-ins with the law. But unfortunately, he almost immediately reoffended and was taken back to jail. He was unexpectedly released again in December, this time with no living arrangement or other supportive resources in place. Simply put, Quinn was dumped back onto the street and left to his own devices, despite his obvious need for close supervision and mental health treatment. Within hours of his release, Quinn was using cocaine and on the fast track to his next violent offense. The Mental Welfare Commission's report concluded that even though having a support plan in place failed to stop Quinn from reoffending after his September release, it may have prevented Geddes' death following his subsequent release 3 months later. In the words of Parliament member Douglas Lumsden, Geddes died because he stepped in where others had failed, including the country's prison aftercare system. The report recommended several changes to healthcare officials and the government for preventing this type of needless tragedy from happening again. A government spokesperson said that the administration would carefully consider the report before responding at length. The Scottish Prison Service then reassured the public of its commitment to supporting recently released inmates as they re-enter society. Geddes' sister Sandra was outraged by the cataclysmic failures that enabled Quinn to slip through the cracks of the system without the proper level of care or oversight. She told the Scottish Sun in 2023 that if Quinn had been given a place to stay upon his release, she believes her brother would still be alive today. In Sandra's words, the alarm bells were ringing over Quinn, but they were ignored. She doesn't want anyone else to go through the pain her family has experienced and has become a vocal advocate for improved regulations and guidelines for keeping violent and high-risk individuals locked up until they're truly safe to live among the public. Number 11. Tiffany Dawn Kelly. One afternoon in September 2018, a young couple approached a 29-year-old wife and mother named Tiffany Kelly outside a Dollar General store in Huntsville, Alabama, and asked her for a ride across town. She agreed, but said that she needed to stop at her house nearby to grab her ID and pick up her husband before taking the pair to their destination. But unfortunately, Kelly never made it home. She was found stabbed to death in the road later that day, less than a mile away from the Dollar General store. Her car, however, was nowhere to be found. The first major break in the case came when a resident living 250 miles away in Clark County contacted law enforcement to report a suspected kidnapping. His cousin, 20-year-old Xavier Scott, and a young woman named Dominic Jackson had shown up at his house that day, just hours after Kelly's murder. The couple got into an argument while they were there, leading the concerned relative to suspect that Scott was forcing Jackson to travel with him against her will. Around the same time, Scott's cousin realized that the license plate on the vehicle the couple showed up in matched Kelly's license plate number, which was being broadcast in news reports about her murder. To add to the suspicion, Scott and Jackson had cleaned out the car while they were at the cousin's home, and they allegedly tried to burn some items that law enforcement later identified as evidence connected to Kelly's murder. As it turned out, Jackson wasn't a kidnapping victim. She'd run away from her home in Clark County about 2 weeks earlier and had hitchhiked to Huntsville with Scott. While there, the couple bounced around from one place to another until they ran out of money, at which point they decided they wanted to return home. But they had no way to get there, so they allegedly hatched a plot to steal a car, and Kelly was their unfortunate victim. Authorities said that they found the murder weapon at Scott's cousin's house, along with obvious signs of blood inside Kelly's car. According to police, Scott and Jackson both vaguely admitted to being involved in the murder, but pointed the finger at one another as the actual killer, and as a result, they were both charged with capital murder. During Dominic Jackson's trial in 2022, Scott took the stand and testified that he killed Kelly. The jury acquitted the young woman of murder but found her guilty of robbery. She nevertheless received a life sentence. Jackson will be eligible for parole at some point, but it's unclear when. Xavier Scott finally went to trial in early May 2023, only for the judge to declare a mistrial on the second day of proceedings. The decision came after the topic of Scott being violent toward Jackson was brought up despite being barred from testimony. After numerous delays due to the COVID-19 pandemic and other issues, Kelly's family was finally looking forward to getting the trial over with so they could close a painful chapter that they'd been forced to live in for nearly 5 years by that point. Scott's case remains unresolved, and unfortunately, it's unclear whether a new trial has been scheduled. Number 10. Michael Arias. On what started out as a normal Saturday in February 2023, an angry customer later identified as 58-year-old Eric Ford entered a Circle K gas station in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and began causing a scene. A female employee told Ford to stop yelling and asked him to leave the property, but he continued to yell in a gas station parking lot, prompting the clerk to go outside and once again ask him to leave. Ford allegedly punched the worker, and a nearby customer named Michael Arias intervened. According to witnesses, Arias asked Ford if he'd hit the employee, and Ford admitted that he had. Arias told Ford that he shouldn't hit women, and their disagreement quickly became physical. Bystanders later claimed that Ford hit Arias first, and that the pair were soon wrestling on the ground near a gas pump as a crowd of shocked onlookers gathered around. Witnesses also said that Ford's wife, Rosalind Lee, got out of her car and started hitting Arias with a cane. The scuffle took a deadly turn when someone pulled a gun and fired multiple shots. Arias was fatally struck in the abdomen, while another bullet hit a man near the groin while he filled his car with gas, causing non-life-threatening injuries. Eric Ford and Rosalind Lee fled the scene, but it wasn't long before investigators caught up with a couple at a local motel they were staying at. During questioning, Ford allegedly denied having a gun, even though a firearm was found in his motel room. Law enforcement also relied on surveillance footage, cell phone video, and witness reports in identifying Ford as their main suspect. Authorities charged Ford with open murder, which means that if a jury decides to convict, they'll get to decide whether the crime qualifies as first, second, or third-degree murder. He was also charged with 1 count of tampering with evidence. Police concluded that Rosalind Lee's actions during the gas station fight enabled Ford to shoot Arias. She is also accused of telling her husband to shoot a man who was fleeing the scene right after the shooting. Lee was charged with murder and aggravated assault. And now Ford is currently being held without bond as he awaits trial. Number 9. Jose Antonio Jimenez Quinones. After getting into a fender bender with his mother's car in August of 2022, 22-year-old Marco Jimenez called his father, 52-year-old Jose Jimenez Quinones, and they fixed the vehicle together. Jimenez Quinones didn't help Marco just because he needed it, but because he truly enjoyed helping people. So when he witnessed a car crash during his drive home from work in Gaston County, North Carolina a few days later, it was only natural for him to pull over and see if anyone needed help. In what can only be described as a truly undeserved act of senseless violence, someone at the scene pulled a gun and fatally shot the Good Samaritan. Multiple witnesses told 911 dispatchers that they saw 2 people exiting the disabled vehicle and fleeing on foot. One caller saw 2 men run from the scene and get into a minivan, although it's unclear whether they were the same 2 men the other callers reported seeing. The caller followed the minivan to a local residence and shared the address with law enforcement. At least one person reported seeing Jimenez Quinones get shot in the back while trying to open the door to a disabled vehicle at the scene. Authorities have released few details about what exactly happened regarding both the accident and the shooting. The situation was clearly chaotic, but the full story remains unclear. Witnesses have reported as many as 4 cars being involved, and at least one of the vehicles fleeing the scene. The murder left the beloved family man's wife and kids both shocked and confused because they knew Jimenez Quinones would never give someone a reason to hurt or kill him. Speaking with Channel 9's Ken Lemon, Marco said that he knew his father was only trying to help, and he told the Gaston Gazette that he wasn't surprised when authorities charged a teenager in connection with the crime, given its senseless nature. The alleged shooter, Tyron Deshaun Dudley, faces 1 count of second-degree murder. When asked whether he felt the charge was justified, Marco told the Gazette that he thinks the accused killer deserves all the suffering he receives in life because he earned it. But for now, Dudley remains innocent under the eyes of the law, and the case is ongoing. Number 8. Javier Leyva. Anytime he was able to, 44-year-old father of three Javier Leyva was quick to lend a helping hand to those in need, including complete strangers. So when he saw a Hyundai SUV with a flat tire along a Houston freeway one day in March 2023, he did what he'd normally do and pulled over to help the driver. As Leyva approached a motorist to ask if they wanted him to change their tire, an unknown vehicle rear-ended a Toyota Corolla, which crashed into the Hyundai, Leyva's pickup truck, and the Good Samaritan himself. The unidentified vehicle fled the scene, and Leyva died from his injuries. Speaking with Click 2 Houston after the tragedy, the victim's daughter, Jessica, described her father as kind and selfless. Both she and Leyva's brother, Oscar, said that whenever he saw someone in a bind, it was in his nature to immediately see if he could do anything to help. He knew how to change a car tire, and that it would only take a few minutes out of his day, so when he saw the stranded Hyundai driver, it was a no-brainer to stop and offer his assistance. Houston Police Sergeant David Rose told the news outlet that it's extremely dangerous for motorists to pull over along the freeway. He said that anytime people are uninjured and capable of getting off the freeway after a minor accident, they should. The hit-and-run driver who hit Leyva remains at large. Almost no identifying details are known about the person, including what kind of vehicle they drive or what the suspect themselves looks like. Houston police are in desperate need of help from anyone who might be able to help identify the suspect and have offered a $5,000 reward in exchange for information leading to an arrest in the case. During her interview with Click 2 Houston, Jessica Leyva issued a statement to the driver, reminding them that if a similar tragedy happened in their family, they'd be just as destroyed as the victim's loved ones are. She implored the suspect to do the right thing and come forward, and for anyone with information to share what they know with law enforcement. Number 7. Jacob Farley. During a Friday night swim with some friends in Missouri's Elk River in 2019, 21-year-old Madison Capps got swept away by a hydraulic current that kept pulling her underwater near a dam, and all she had to help her stay above the surface was a small float. A 26-year-old stranger named Jacob Farley, who was passing through on a float tour with another group, saw the young woman struggling and dove into the water to try rescuing her. But he also got sucked into the current, trapping them both in the churning waters. Farley helped Madison stay above water for the next half hour while they awaited rescue, even as he fought to stay alive himself. When emergency responders finally arrived, Madison was able to grab onto a rope that they threw out into the water. She was pulled to safety, but Farley got dragged underwater and drowned, leaving behind a young son. Madison told Fox 43 that having Farley there to comfort her and help her fight to stay alive made a difference in her survival. She said she didn't think she'd have made it if he hadn't been there, and she credited him with saving her life. In addition to being grateful, Madison said she felt guilty because Farley wouldn't have gotten stuck himself if she hadn't gotten trapped. And since she never got a chance to know the hero who saved her life, she learned about him from his family and friends, and she made sure they knew that she'd never forget the sacrifice he made. Number 6. James Nichol. 41-year-old James Nichol and his partner were crossing a bridge over the River Liffey in Dublin, Ireland on Easter morning in 2023 when he saw a man struggling in the river. He was in urgent need of help, and as a former soldier who'd served in the military during the early 2000s, he thought he was a strong enough swimmer to rescue the man. People tried to talk Nichol out of jumping into the freezing cold water, and in addition to the fact that he was about to do something dangerous to begin with, it was 1:30 a.m. and far from sunrise. But he took the plunge anyway. Nichol had unfortunately either overestimated his swimming abilities, underestimated the strength of the river's current, or both. And as he tried to reach the man he jumped in to save, someone alerted nearby police that there were 2 men struggling in the river. By the time the officers arrived at the scene, however, both Nichol and the other man had vanished from sight. And sadly, their bodies were found later that morning. Nichol's sister, Deborah, told RTE Liveline that her brother had gotten sober after struggling with addiction. He was awaiting housing when he unexpectedly lost his life. Deborah described Nichol as a funny, witty, kind soul who was full of life. He was also remembered for the selfless bravery he showed in his attempts to rescue a complete stranger during his last moments on Earth. Number 5. John Arias. In an alarming encounter that was captured on camera in 2023, a girl was walking to school one morning in Los Angeles when a homeless woman approached and attacked her for no apparent reason. The woman struck the victim in the face and wrestled her to the ground while shouting racial slurs. After noticing what was happening, a bystander named John Arias sprang into action without a second thought. He rushed over to the scene and was slashed in the nose with a box cutter while trying to push the attacker off the victim. Despite his injury, Arias managed to free the victim, who continued on her walk to school, and he held the woman down until law enforcement arrived. Arias was running late on his way to meet his friend, Victor Camarena, after losing his car keys and getting delayed, which is the only reason he arrived in the area when he did. Camarena, who's a trained EMT, showed up during the altercation to find Arias with blood gushing from his face. He then rushed over to help detain the woman and call 911. Once he was able to, Camarena administered first aid to Arias while waiting for paramedics to arrive. The laceration that Arias received likely hurt, but it was a small price to pay for making sure the victim was safe. He told local station Fox 11 that he immediately thought of his own daughter when he saw the incident unfolding in front of him, and that it was what prompted him to take action. Arias said that the attack appeared to be a random hate crime triggered by racism, and that he was glad he was there to help. Number 4. Kenneth Salazar. 57-year-old Kenneth Salazar was a Gulf War veteran, cancer survivor, happily married husband, and proud grandfather from San Antonio, Texas, who enjoyed working on cars and motorcycles. He was also happy to help someone in need, so when a stranger required help fixing their car outside a motel one day in July 2021, Salazar didn't think twice about saying yes. While he was working on the vehicle, he got into an argument with a man in the motel's parking lot. During the disagreement, the stranger threatened to shoot Salazar, and he eventually pulled a gun and made good on his word. The shooter fled the scene with a woman in a red vehicle, and Salazar was taken to the hospital with what doctors initially believed was a non-life-threatening gunshot wound to the abdomen. His condition unexpectedly deteriorated over the next 3 days, and sadly, he died from his injuries. Inside one of the motel rooms, investigators found a cell phone and fingerprints belonging to 37-year-old Leopoldo Mora. 2 witnesses and an anonymous tipster implicated Mora in the shooting, and surveillance footage of the crime also put him at the scene. Authorities tracked the suspect down at his apartment and arrested him on suspicion of murder and a parole violation. And in the end, a jury found Mora guilty of Salazar's murder in early 2023 after deliberating for just 1 hour. For his reckless actions, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Number 3. Gary Ariano. When 63-year-old Gary Ariano saw 2 teenage girls beating each other up at a park in Denver, Colorado in April 2022, he attempted to break up the fight. But sadly, he was shot to death by a bystander. A witness followed the alleged shooter as he left the park and tipped police off to the suspect's whereabouts. Authorities charged 24-year-old Trehavani Smith, the boyfriend of one of the girls involved in the fight, with first-degree murder. Ariano's nephew, Aiden, told 9 News that his uncle visited La Alma Park every single day with the same group of friends. According to him, it was his favorite hangout spot. Aiden described Ariano as a positive, outgoing, and helpful person who cared about his community. The events that led to the Good Samaritan's death began earlier that day when the 2 young women got into a fight in downtown Denver. Later on, they agreed over text message to meet back up at the park and duke it out for a second time. Speaking with Fox 31, Ariano's sister-in-law Tracy Glassman Ariano called for an end to gun violence and the needless tragedies that come along with it. 3 months after Gary's death, his family and the community dedicated a bench in his honor at the park. Number 2. Elise Chambellan. Just weeks before she was due to compete in the Miss Universe Australia pageant final in 2016, 20-year-old Elise Chambellan was viciously attacked while trying to break up a fight in a nightclub bathroom. The incident happened during the early morning hours at a club in Queensland, where Chambellan saw an altercation going on between 2 groups of women and tried to intervene. Her intention was to defuse the situation, but the exact opposite happened. In what Chambellan later described as an unprovoked assault, 4 of the women beat her in the face and head, yanking handfuls of her hair out of her scalp as the trained martial artist tried to defend herself. A man who overheard the fight eventually entered the bathroom and pulled Chambellan away from her attackers. She was taken to the hospital, where she underwent 8 hours of x-rays to see if her bones were injured. Luckily, nothing was broken, but the young woman suffered from multiple painful and visible injuries, including black eyes, a busted lip, whiplash, a mild concussion, and multiple soft spots and sores on her head where she'd been beaten. She also had bald spots where chunks of her hair had been ripped out. In a social media post, Chambellan said that she was angry and disgusted by her attackers' behavior, wondering, is this a type of society we have become? She further questioned, do we not all yet understand that this is how people die? And how many more young lives with huge potential and so many loved ones will be lost to this horrendous behavior? Chambellan may have lost a physical fight, but she administered one verbal jab after another, describing her attackers and people like them as having a pathetic, spineless, entitled attitude. She vowed to remain vocal about the matter and said that she refused to sweep it under the rug or stand by and watch as innocent people fall victim to senseless acts of violence. Number 1. Casey Rivera. While driving his children home from school in Rocklin, California in May 2023, 41-year-old father of 2 Casey Rivera spotted a family of ducks trying to cross a busy intersection. Worried for their safety, he parked his car and went to guide the ducks across. Rivera had just finished shooing them to the other side of the road and was on his way back to his car when a vehicle appeared out of nowhere and slammed into him, and he died at the scene despite paramedics' best efforts to save him. The teenage driver who hit him remained at the crash site while authorities investigated the incident. It was a sad situation from every angle, according to community member Diane Meyerson, who shared her thoughts with local station KXTV. A man was killed while performing an act of kindness, and 2 lives were ruined. On a fundraising page to help the surviving family members with expenses, Rivera's aunt Tracy described how his final compassionate act in the world was a true reflection of the kind of person he was. A witness told local station KCRA3 that bystanders were clapping as Rivera shepherded the mother duck and her ducklings across the road before the heartwarming moment turned tragic. According to the most recent updates on the case, the investigation into the heartbreaking accident is ongoing. A Placer County Sheriff's spokesperson told NBC News that the young driver who struck Rivera was cooperating with authorities and likely won't face criminal charges.
If a close friend suddenly began acting hateful toward a group of people or a certain demographic after never showing any signs of those beliefs in the past, how would you react? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.